There is a kind of quiet that only belongs to people who have stopped waiting to be noticed. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up in a woodpile stacked tighter than it needs to be, in a window frame repainted when no one asked, in a woman who rises before the birds and begins the work of saving something the world has already written off. Judith Crane had that kind of quiet. She had carried it since she was 19, when her father died of a chest ailment 2 weeks after the first hard frost and left her with 160 acres of Montague County scrubland, a mule named Cobalt, and a lien on the property she hadn't known existed. She was 28 now. The lien was still there. So was she. The land sat at the southern edge of the Brazos River Basin, in a part of North Texas that the railroad had bypassed twice and the county surveyor visited only under protest. Red cedar and mesquite ran along the creek beds. The soil was thin but honest. It gave back what you put in, if you put in enough, and Judith had been putting in everything she had for 9 years. She kept goats because goats cost less to feed than cattle, and because they asked nothing of you emotionally, which suited her. She kept a kitchen garden along the south wall of the house, planted in rows, so straight they looked measured, because they were. She kept accounts in a leather ledger her father had used before her, every transaction recorded in the same careful hand, columns balanced to the penny, nothing invented, nothing avoided. The house itself was a practical thing. Single story, rock and mortar construction, the kind of building that would outlast the people inside it without particular effort. The east window had cracked in the January ice storm, and she had replaced it herself with glass she'd traded 3 months of soap making to obtain. The front porch leaned slightly to the left. She had shimmed it twice. It leaned anyway. What she had not been able to fix was the water. The spring that fed her property, a cold, reliable thing her father had called Providence Spring, with the particular optimism of a man who believed naming something well was half the work, had been running slower every season since 1881. This was 1884, and it was running at less than half what it had been when she arrived. The cause was not mysterious. 12 miles north, a cattle operation called Harwick & Sons had sunk 4 new wells in 3 years, and the water table in Montague County had been paying for it ever since. She had written to the county commissioner twice. The second letter had been returned unopened, so she managed. She learned the patterns of what remained. She irrigated by hand on the days the spring dropped below the lip of the stone basin, carrying water in 2 buckets on a yoke she'd fashioned from a wagon tongue, back and forth from the creek, 100 yards each trip on't. Her hands had changed shape over 9 years. The calluses sat where they sat now permanently, and she had stopped noticing them the way a person stops noticing the sound of a clock. The morning Bennett Aldridge rode onto her property, she was doing exactly this. She heard the horse before she saw it. She set down the yoke, straightened and waited. She did not reach for anything. She had learned the difference between the sound of a horse moving with intention and a horse moving with threat, and this one moved with intention only. He came around the cedar break at a walk, a bay quarter horse, well kept, working tack with no silver on it. The tack of a man who understood that ornament on a working horse was vanity. The man himself was perhaps 50, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had been organized by weather into something neither handsome nor plain but permanent. He wore a coat that had seen 3 winters at least, and a hat that had seen more. He did not look like a man accustomed to arriving anywhere unannounced. He stopped at a distance that was respectful. He looked at the buckets, the yoke, the garden, the spring basin. He looked at her. "Morning," he said. "Morning," Judith said. "Your spring?" He nodded toward the basin. "My land," she said. "Spring comes with it." He stepped down from the horse in the deliberate way of a man whose knees had opinions about such things but had learned to override them. He walked to the spring basin without being invited and crouched beside it, looking at the water level, the rock face, at the moss line that showed where the water had been. "It's dropped," he said, 2 feet since March. He looked north. She watched him do the arithmetic she had already done. "Harwick," he said. "That's my understanding." He stood. He looked at her with the directness of someone who had long since stopped softening assessments out of politeness. "Bennett Aldridge," he said. "I run the Triple Bar, Calhoun Creek Basin, about 14 miles east." She had heard the name. Triple Bar was not a small operation. She had heard it mentioned the way county people mentioned things that were too large to ignore and too established to argue with, in the same tone they used for the railroad and the weather. "Judith Crane," she said. "How long has the spring been declining?" 3 years measurably. Likely 4, if I'm honest about early signs. He looked at the yoke on the ground, the worn leather of the shoulder pads, the creek 100 yards off. He did not say anything sympathetic. She appreciated that. "What's your acreage?" 160. 40 cleared, rest is cedar and creek margin. Water rights registered. Surface rights with the land. Spring is documented in the original survey, 1871. He nodded once. Then he walked to her garden and stood at its edge without crossing into it, looking at the rows, at the plants, at the careful evidence of someone making something from insufficient material. "You're irrigating this by hand," he said, "when the spring can't manage it." He turned and looked at the house, at the east window with its newer glass, at the porch with its shim. He looked at all of it the way a man looks at something when he is actually seeing it, rather than merely observing. "I'm going to ride your spring line," he said. "Northeast corner to Creek Junction, you mind?" She minded nothing about the spring line. She minded very much about anything else. "Spring's free to look at," she said. He nodded and remounted. He rode the spring line slowly, dismounting twice, crouching once to examine the soil moisture. She watched from the garden. She did not follow him. When he came back, he tied his horse to the porch rail and sat on the step without being invited, which she noted. "The aquifer they're drawing from and yours share a formation," he said. "I've had my surveyor map it. The drop on your end is directly consequential to their extraction rate. I know, you've documented this in writing to the county commissioner. Twice, and the second letter came back." Something moved through his expression. Not surprise, something older than surprise. "I have a situation," he said. "My east pasture borders the Harwick operation. They've been grazing over the survey line, not much, 20, 30 head at a time, but consistent. My foreman has documented it. I've written to Harwick directly." He paused. "Harwick writes back." She waited. "He writes back with a lawyer's letterhead and language about disputed boundaries. The boundary is not disputed. The survey is clear. What he's doing is making the dispute expensive enough that I'm supposed to stop bothering." She understood. She had never had enough to be worth disputing, so the tactic was beyond what had been applied to her. But she understood the mechanism. "What I'm going to do," Bennett said, "is file a formal water rights complaint with the state land office. Not the county, the state. Combined extraction impact, documented aquifer connection, corroborating survey data." He looked at her steadily. "Your spring documentation would corroborate mine. Your situation is secondary evidence of primary harm." She looked at him. "You want my records. I want your cooperation. That includes your records, your testimony if it comes to that, and your name on a joint complaint." "What do I get?" Not a question. A statement of how the negotiation worked. "Pipeline access," he said without hesitation, which meant he had prepared for the question, which meant he respected her enough to prepare. "Triple Bar runs a gravity feed line from the Calhoun Creek intake, northwest corner of my property. If you're on the joint complaint, I extend the line to your eastern fence. You get clean, reliable water for the garden and the house. Your goats drink from the creek regardless, but the spring issue goes away." She said nothing immediately. She never said anything that deserved thought without giving it thought. "How long would the line take?" 2 weeks once materials are in. My crew has done it before. If the complaint fails, the line stays. The agreement is independent of the outcome." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because the complaint is the right thing to file regardless. And because a woman carrying water 100 yards with a wagon tong yoke is a waste of ability that could be doing something else." He said it without ceremony, the way people say things they actually mean. She asked him to come back Thursday. He came back Thursday. She had pulled her father's original survey, the spring documentation, 3 years of water level records from the ledger, and the 2 unanswered letters to the county commissioner, copied in her own hand with dates and notations. He looked through all of it at her kitchen table. He asked 3 questions. She answered all 3 without equivocation. He made 1 note in a small book. "This is thorough," he said. "Records are how you prove what happened," she said. "My father taught me that. He just didn't live long enough to use them." Bennett looked up from the papers. He did not offer condolence. He simply acknowledged the fact of it with the quiet that people use when they understand that some things don't benefit from words. They signed a joint agreement before he left, 2 copies. She kept one in the ledger. His crew arrived the following Monday. 4 men, a pipe wagon, and a surveyor with a level and a marked chain. Judith was already at the eastern fence when they pulled in, wearing her work coat, carrying a post hole tool. The foreman, a compact man named Sterling, whose hands were the size of small shovels, looked at her and then at the tool and said, simply, "That section there." She worked the fence line with them. The pipe trench ran parallel to the fence for 200 yards and then angled northwest toward the Calhoun Creek intake. The soil was hard red clay for the first 18 inches and then broke into something more cooperative. She hit a buried cedar root at the 3-hour mark and spent 20 minutes working it out without asking for help. Sterling noticed and said nothing, which was the appropriate response. By the second day, her shoulders ached in the bone-deep way that comes from sustained, unfamiliar angles of effort. She adjusted her grip and kept moving. What she was doing was not asking to be included. She was simply present for the work on her own land, and anyone who treated that differently than they would treat a man doing the same thing would have to manage that difference themselves. Sterling did not manage any difference. His crew followed his lead. On the 3rd evening, Bennett arrived to check progress. He found Judith and Sterling at the intake connection point, discussing the valve placement. "She wants the shutoff on this side of the property line," Sterling said. "Gives her control of her own supply independent of the main." Bennett looked at her. "That's correct," he said. "Put it where she wants it." She noted that he had not said that makes sense or good idea. He had said it was correct, as if the question had a right answer and she had found it, which was the truth. The joint complaint was filed with the Texas State Land Office on a Thursday in late October. Bennett's lawyer in Decatur prepared the documents. Judith's survey records and water logs were attached as Exhibit B. The complaint named Harwick and Sons specifically and cited documented aquifer impact to 2 separate properties across a period of 3 years. Harwick's response arrived in 6 weeks. It came on a Tuesday, and Judith heard about it from the mail carrier before she heard it from Bennett, which was fine because the mail carrier's version was essentially accurate. Harwick had responded with a counterfiling that questioned the survey methodology and attempted to characterize the aquifer connection as speculative. She was cutting cedar along the south fence line when Bennett rode up that same afternoon. "You've heard," he said. "Enough." He dismounted and told her the rest of it. The counterfiling was aggressive but not surprising. Harwick had done this before in 2 other counties, contest the methodology rather than the evidence, make the process expensive and slow. What was different this time was that the State Land Office had assigned a formal investigator. That was not what happened in 2 other counties. "Why different?" she asked. "Because the documentation is airtight," he said. "Your water logs, specifically. 3 years of dated sequential measurements in a consistent format. It's harder to call speculative than a single survey." She had not known, when she started keeping those records, that they would matter to anyone but herself. She had kept them because her father had kept records, and because she had no other way to hold on to what was true about her own land. The investigator from Austin arrived on a gray November morning. His name was Prentice Call, and he wore a city coat and carried a case of instruments that he handled with the reverence of a man who had spent years learning to use them. He spent 2 days on the property. He measured the spring output 3 times. He mapped the aquifer connection with a technique he explained to her in detail when she asked, because she asked in a way that indicated she would understand the answer. He told her, before he left, that he had seen similar situations in 6 counties. He said that in most cases the documentation had not been sufficient. He looked at her ledger, at the 9 years of records, and said that this was not most cases. She thanked him and did not make more of it than that. The ruling came in February, 6 months after the initial filing. Harwick & Sons was ordered to reduce extraction rates on 2 of the 4 northern wells to levels consistent with documented pre-impact aquifer output. The disputed boundary on Bennett's east pasture was remanded to the county surveyor for formal reestablishment, with costs to Harwick. It was not everything. It was enough. The morning after she received the notice, Judith walked the spring line at first light. The spring would not recover immediately. These things moved at the pace of water, which was its own pace and argued with no one. But by the following spring, the survey hydrologist had estimated the output should recover to something near what the moss line remembered. She stood at the stone basin in the early morning cold and looked at the water level. It was not higher yet, but it would be. She had been carrying those buckets for 3 years. She had not asked to be carrying them. She had not complained about carrying them either. She had simply carried them and kept her records and written her letters and stayed on her land when any reasonable calculation would have suggested leaving. The water line from Calhoun Creek was already running. She could hear it in the pipe below the frost line, a small constant movement in the frozen ground, the sound of something reliable. There is a kind of justice that does not arrive with a speech. It arrives in a dropped water level that begins slowly to rise. It arrives in a foreman who points to a section of trench and waits for the landowner to decide where the shutoff goes. It arrives in a man who files a complaint because it is correct, not because it is easy, and in a woman whose records proved what the land had been trying to say for 3 years without anyone listening. That spring, Judith planted an expanded kitchen garden. She had water now. She used it. The goats were fat and specific in their opinions, as goats tend to be. The porch still leaned slightly left, but she had decided it had been leaning long enough that it had earned the right to lean, and she left it alone. Bennett rode by in April to check the line pressure. He found her at the spring basin, which had recovered to just below the original moss line and was rising slowly, with the patience of things that have been working underground for longer than anyone has been watching. "How's the output?" he asked. "Improving," she said. "Should reach the original level by midsummer, if Prentice's estimate holds." He nodded. He looked at the garden, which was already showing early green through the fresh-turned rows. "Squash this year?" he asked. "Squash, beans, and I'm trying sorghum in the south plot, testing the drainage." Sound decision. They stood in the April light. A cardinal went about his business in the cedar brake and did not consult either of them about it. The spring kept rising. The records kept building. The land gave back what she put in, the way it always had, and Judith Crane kept putting in everything she had, the way she always had, and wasted none of it on wishing things had been otherwise. She had a water line and a filed complaint, and a ruling from the state of Texas, and 9 years of ledger entries that told the true history of this piece of ground. She did not hang the ruling on the wall. She put it in the ledger where it belonged, with everything else that was true. You're watching Shadows of the Deep West, where the West is told the way it actually was. Leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. I read every single one. The next story is already waiting.